Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Roberts and he's Mark Pinkett. And we're going to be talking today about masculinity in Romeo and Juliet. We normally talk about masculinity in our book, Boys Don't Try, which you might know as from that. But we're going to be turning to our roots today as English teachers and talking about something that we feel pretty passionate about. Sarah's just been talking there about literature being this living conversation. And that's what this is going to be. We're going to talk about a few ideas about the main aspects of masculinity within the play. Some of them might be some of the more well-known things, but we're going to try and come at things from different angles as well, and hopefully get you thinking about certain parts of masculinity that you might not have seen or thought about in the play before. We're not going to be able to come up with some kind of neat conclusion for this and tie everything together. We're going to look at 5 kind of key discussion points, really. And through that, we can hopefully get some kind of debate going, and we'd love to hear your questions as we get going further on into the play and discussing it on Twitter. So just 1 minute, I just got one more technical issue. I just need to make sure I can move forward now. Okay, bear with me.
Okay, Matt, sorry, Mark, if you just click on the middle of your PowerPoint slide, it should move it on.
There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about sex, violence, Queen Elizabeth, Romeo, and we're going to do that thing that sometimes annoys people, where we're talking about what was Shakespeare trying to do, what was Shakespeare thinking at this moment in time as well. So, Mark, do we really have to teach the sex stuff?
Yeah, if you press the next slide, you've got my answer. Of course, we need to talk about the sex stuff. You know, Romeo and Juliet is a play that's kind of replete with sexual innuendo. And I think that, in fact, if we kind of consider that the play isn't actually a play about romance or young love, but actually it's a play about masculinity, I think many people might say that the smut and the sex kind of sits along the violence in the play that makes it this quite masculine play. And the play begins and it ends with innuendo. It's kind of enveloped in sex. That famous opening scene from which the title of this talk comes is awash with language of sexual bravado and sexual violence. But I think it's interesting that in actual fact, this opening scene is not where the sexual innuendo of the play begins. So if we look at the prologue from the play, we see that 5th line down from forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes. Now, anybody that knows anything about original pronunciation, and if you don't, I strongly recommend you in YouTube just put in David Crystal original pronunciation. There's a wonderful little video where he talks about original pronunciation. And in that video, he talks about this line. Now, loins actually in original Shakespeare was pronounced lines, all right, the original line. So that's what the audience would have heard. And lines, of course, referring to the kind of genealogical lines of the Montague and Capulet families. However, the word that Shakespeare wrote down was actually loins. So what we've got there again already is this kind of sexual innuendo and wordplay, and that you know, for the eyes of the reader or the ears of the kind of the more astute, filthy-minded listener, Shakespeare, right in the prologue, you know, by mentioning the loins of these families, is drawing our attention to the kind of the act of the lovers' sexual engendering, and this is what Stanley Wells is referring to when he writes that, you know, right from the beginning of the play, this couple is are talking about sex, or they're being associated with sex. Mark, did you want to? So that's sex right from the start of the play. Did you want to talk about sex at the end of the play? Because I've said that this is a play that is enveloped. You know, it's almost bookended in sex.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And if we take a look at the end, this part where Juliet takes her life. On the surface of it, we just got this sad moment as she you know, uses the dagger. But I think when we look at the etymology of this word sheath, vagina was the Latin word for sheath. So there's something very sexualized that's going on here as well. And when you look at the verb rust, it suggests this kind of perpetual penetration where they're kind of erotic life together is going to go on into the afterlife. And Bloom says that when Shakespeare is writing about death, and it brings this real charged eroticism to it as well. So even in these kind of scenes where we anticipate that it's just going to be about the tragic outcome, there's something else going on. And you see that in the way that Romeo talks about death being personified as this kind of paramour who wants to get his hands on Juliet as well. There's something interesting going on in this. When we think about the Protestant tradition that Shakespeare's writing from, Rami Targoff argues that in reality, for Protestants, there's not any possibility of sex going on and being reunited in the afterlife. So for that reason, he says that Romeo and Juliet is this great expression of carpe diem. And so when it comes to the idea of sex, it's not just seize the day, it's kind of seize each other while you can, seize each other's bodies while you can. So there's something else going on there in the background as well.
Okay, and so this kind of begs the question, doesn't it? Why is Shakespeare so keen to kind of connect Romeo and Juliet with sex and fornication? Now, the obvious answer, I guess, is that while this is a play about masculinity, it is also a play about love, and often people in love want to have sex with each other. And I think that to cut sex from this play, or to not teach sex in this play, is to kind of prohibit students' kind of understanding of Romeo and Juliet as kind of multifaceted human beings who are as susceptible to, you know, baser kind of carnal desires as they are exalted and sublime emotions such as love. I do want to talk now about the kind of the binary distinctions that people often wrongly make about romantic love and the act of sex. Some critics, readers and watchers of Shakespeare, they often make the mistake of kind of seeing Romeo and Juliet as distinct from the unpleasant sexualized language of the members of the Montague and Capulet gangs that we see in the opening scene, or distinct, you know, from the kind of the humorous sexual innuendo and baldy of Mercutio and the nurse. Certainly, I think people often see Romeo in that way, as this kind of romantic lover. But I do think actually it's important to realise that Romeo can be just as kind of unpleasant in his sexualised language as other characters in the play. I mean, if we look here, this is a rather disturbing speech from Act 1, Scene 1, in which you'll see that for Romeo, Rosaline's chastity is a shield which must be overcome by force. And it's interesting that given that love is something that Romeo so adores later in the play, that here he's positioning love as weak. If you just click there, Mark. So love is weak in the face of sexual restraint. And it's perhaps this realization that love is not enough that prompts Romeo to employ more active methods that you know, centuries later, us men still place blind faith in. So you know, he tries a bit of sweet talk, staring, and then when that doesn't work, he tries some money. And ultimately, at this point, I think Romeo is no better than Samson and Gregory, and in the way that he talks about women and that kind of sexual violence. And like them, you know, he sees sexual satisfaction or gratification as something that is to be gained by force. And of course, if the idea that sex is what we're talking about here is in any doubt, Shakespeare kind of makes us as the reader or the audience member, makes us complicit in Romeo's kind of lustful obsession by, you know, giving us this image of Rosaline's open lap right at the end there. So just very quickly before I hand over to Mark, I do just want to quickly look at this kind of this famous Queen Mab's speech, or infamous Queen Mab's speech by Mercutio in Act 1, Scene 4. People often see this speech as kind of a bit unusual, a bit of an oddity, fascinating, frightening, but kind of an obscurity nonetheless. And I think if anyone's seen the Lerman version of Romeo and Juliet, you'll be familiar with such a reading in performance terms. However, the critic Harold Bloom, he argues that rather than this speech just being the mad ramblings of a kind of fevered Mercutio, this speech is exactly in keeping with Mercutio's character throughout the rest of the play, because it's a speech all about sex. And Romeo's response to Mercutio's erotic ramblings is to interrupt him. So what Romeo says to Mercutio is, "Peace, peace, Mercutio, you talk of nothing." And of course, we know that nothing means no thing, and it's a pun about vaginas, and you know, obviously, much ado about nothing is famous for using that pun. So I think Romeo's kind of innuendo here is this kind of assertion of masculine understanding to the world, both inside and outside of the play. Mercutio's just talking nonsense, but Romeo and Mercutio are kind of united in their masculine preoccupation with sex. So here what we're seeing is Romeo using innuendo and sexual innuendo as a means of solidifying that masculine bond. And I think that's really interesting. So should we teach the sex stuff? Yeah. I think it's corny, but Shakespeare teaches us how to exist and, you know, how to be human. And our students do need to realise, I think, that sex is a large part of the human condition. Whether it's sex as a byproduct of romantic love or as a means of subjugation and harassment, normally of women, at the hands.
Okay. All right, next question then for you, Mark. So what does the violence of the play tell us about what's going on in terms of masculinity?
I mean, firstly, I think it's important to realise that Romeo and Juliet isn't just a play about masculinity in the 14th century or even the 17th century. It's a play about masculinity in 2020, I think. You know, Neil McGregor went as far to say, you know, that it's more akin to Clockwork Orange than a love story. In answer to the question, what does the violence in the play teach us about masculinity? It teaches us that in some cultures, you know, violence is synonymous with masculinity. Masculine violence reveals itself in many forms in this play. You just click there, Mark. And, you know, if we ignore a few periphery characters like Peter, the kind of permeating power of violence in this play is something that all the men succumb to in one way or another, except for one man. And it's interesting, this actually. The one man who manages not to give in to violence is Friar Lawrence. And yet, ironically or interestingly, his most famous line, arguably the most important line in the play, shows that even he as a man of religion, he is a man nonetheless, and he recognises the kind of all-consuming power of violence. And you know, and despite not succumbing to violence himself, I do think he can be. I think he encourages it in Romeo. You know, when he tells an emotionally broken Romeo, "Your tears are womanish." He's asking Romeo to be a man again, and in this play, being a man means being violent. And being a man does mean being violent in this play. In fact, you know, men see it as an art form. I think if we look at Mercutio's admiration, albeit slightly mocking, of Tybalt's kind of sword play. So what we've got here is, you know, prick song is music that's been written down or pricked onto paper, but that word prick is used elsewhere in the play by Mercutio as a word for the male appendage. So what you've got in this speech here is, we can see that this speech encapsulates the masculinity of play and the wider world in general, where you've got this like intertwining of sex and violence in this strange mix together, and it's kind of venerated by men as an art form, something to strive for, you know, for yourselves and to admire in others. You know, yeah, that's a good quote there. Right, Mark. So, and enough of me. How does this idea of masculinity, how does it relate to Queen Elizabeth I?
Okay, so if we think about the context of what's going on at the time, we've had, you know, 4 decades or so of this apparently glorious reign, where we have this golden age, where Elizabeth, against the odds, has become this real figurehead who's managed to embrace these masculine values of being seen to be able to defend the nation. And we get this famous speech, which is probably apocryphal, that she delivers at Tilbury in 1588, just before the success of the defence against the Armada, where she says that despite having this kind of feeble frame of the woman as she sees it, she says that she's able to embody these masculine values and to be able to use a kind of assertive violence to defend. So this is something that enables her to succeed as a woman in this patriarchal world. But there's this other side of how Elizabeth is viewed, where we get this cult that builds up around the fact that she's this chaste and pure queen who is keen to encourage comparisons of herself to Petrarch's Laura. So she's this kind of chaste and pure, unattainable person up on a pedestal. And in a lot of the cultural iconography of the time, we see these artistic references to Elizabeth as the moon, and more specifically as Diana, the Roman goddess of the moon, and this protector of virgins. And this is something you see loads in A Midsummer Night's Dream as well, which bear in mind that Shakespeare is writing at the same time. Quick recommendation, if you've not listened to the In Our Time version of Midsummer Night's Dream, I really recommend it as brilliant context for Romeo and Juliet as well. So we've got this going on. So we would then be surprised that by 1595, of the time that Romeo and Juliet appears, things are not looking as well for Elizabeth. She's frail in health, and we've got this succession crisis going on where she's not naming who's going to be heir to the throne, and it's bringing about this real concern within the nation, particularly among some of the elites like Devereux, Earl of Essex, who's arguing that society needs to become more masculine again, and it needs to start to embrace some of the more traditions of chivalry rather than moving towards this humanistic approach. And they see that Elizabeth has now become this kind of embodiment of this weakness and this frailness and this sickness that they see within the society, rather than having this kind of more dynamic, warlike attitude. So when we normally see these references to the moon in Shakespeare, it seems to be celebrating and this kind of more adoration of Elizabeth. But actually, some critics say that this complementary framework is now this smokescreen for this inherent criticism and this subtle criticism of what society has become under Elizabeth, and that is perhaps playing to the likes of Essex in recognising this. So let's have a look at a couple of examples from the play. So on the surface, when Romeo compares Juliet to the sun, or metaphorically as the sun, it seems to just be this reference to her beauty and the envious others, and talking about subtly trying to take her virginity, killing the envious moon. But the reference to the moon, who's sick and pale in the background, gives you this sense that there's this reference to Elizabeth as being someone who's a bit frail and feeble. And then in Juliet's speech, not long after, we get this bit where she says, "Swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon." So we get this sense of this criticism again of Elizabeth for lacking this stereotypical masculinity of being decisive and dynamic and being able to have this real assertive approach to the way that society needs to go. So there's some really interesting things going on in the background when we think about Elizabeth and masculinity. So Matt, this is a favourite conversation of yours. Why do you think everyone always has a pop at Romeo?
Yeah, so I guess really this is an apology in the Latin sense, a kind of a defence of Romeo. I think before I attempt to advocate for Romeo, I do think he's an idiot. Like, only idiots kill people, right? And Romeo is a killer. But there are, I think, facets of his personality that we need to forgive. So I think one of the reasons people slag Romeo off is the fact that he talks about his feelings. I was going through Twitter recently, and I got some comments on the next slide about the kind of things that people say about Romeo. And what I think people mean is, when they say these things, is I think they're criticising him for talking about his feelings. I've never understood this line of thinking or this line of criticism, because when we're talking about masculinity, isn't Romeo just doing all those things that good people want our young boys to be doing? Like expressing himself, talking about his feelings. And who cares if the poetry's bad? Like, he's writing poetry about how he feels. So I think that Romeo should be kind of championed, almost, in the sense that he's a man who doesn't suffer like from this kind of emotional mutism that so many other young men, or men generally, suffer from. Another thing, just not so academic here, I'm just going to rant. I think another reason that people hate Romeo is they think he's fickle. So he's often criticised for the way he falls straight out of love with Rosaline the moment he meets Juliet. And again, I've never got this, because isn't it just the case that he thought he loved one person, and then he saw another person who invoked greater feelings in him, causing him to realise that actually what he thought was love before wasn't love? I mean, doesn't everyone think they're in love until they meet someone that they're more in love with? So again, I don't think that whole fickle thing works. On the slide right now is, you know, whilst I'm loath to psychoanalyze or assign diagnoses, medical diagnoses to kind of fictional constructs, I did once write this in a book I wrote, it's this one, and I'll just let you have a look at that if you haven't read it already. Now, I would never write about Romeo this way in an academic essay, and whether I'm right or wrong here in what I said is up for debate, but I do think it's a debate worth having in class. I think the texts that we teach are an opportunity to get students talking, and I think that too many schools see Romeo and Juliet as a girly text, all right, you know, often with boy-heavy bottom sets, it's ditched in favour of the allegedly more violent or more masculine Macbeth. But actually, I think discussing Romeo's experience of the world and the way in which he deals with it is a great opportunity to engage boys in the play and in discussions, actually, just more generally about male mental health. And because of this, I think we need to be careful in constantly criticising Romeo. A phrase I always use is critique him, but don't criticise him. Before I finish in like this kind of this strange kind of defence of the murder of Romeo, I do want to blame Mercutio for Romeo's killing of Tybalt. As we're well aware, Romeo tries to intervene as Mercutio and Tybalt fight, and as he does so, Mercutio is slain. And Mercutio, as he's dying, immediately lays the blame at the door of his friend Romeo. For me, the most heartbreaking thing here isn't that first thing, but it's that last thing where he says, "Help me into some house, Benvolio." I think this is an astonishing moment of cruelty. You know, Romeo is being rejected in favour of someone else just moments after he's tried to save Mercutio's life. And I think it's kind of this final rejection, the favouring of Benvolio over himself, that propels Romeo to kill Tybalt. You click the slide, Mark. So, you know, here, I think what we've got is enacting bloody revenge on Tybalt is a means of atoning for the death of his friend. But I think, you know, Romeo isn't just a murderous and foolish killer. He's a product of this patriarchal society, which equates maleness with violence and aggression and femaleness with timid passivity, you know. And so I think when Romeo kills Tybalt, he's not just atoning for the death of his friend. He's trying to reconnect with that masculinity, which he feels his relationship with Juliet has threatened. But Mark, you have a different theory about Romeo, don't you?
Yeah, and again, I know this is not everyone's cup of tea. This kind of what was Shakespeare trying to say. But I think that when we look at the presentation of Romeo and this poetic language that you talk about and his attitude as a lover, I think there's something to be gained from thinking about Shakespeare's attitude towards language and how that might influence his characterization of Romeo. And in particular in terms of his masculinity. So we know that Romeo's set up as this Petrarchan lover, and he fits all these kind of archetypal definitions where he is very much the jilted and unrequited lover, and it's a very hyperbolized, over the top embracing of these kind of melancholic emotions. And he sees him in some senses really passive and kind of abandoned to the fate of this powerful and chaste mistress in Rosaline. When you think of Rosaline as the rose, it's kind of like beautiful, but kind of temporary and all those kind of things. And I think the key thing that you fit into this idea is this pleasurable pain that fits into a lot of the oxymorons that we see Shakespeare give Romeo at the early starts of the play. So this is how he's set up. And in terms of the language that you talked about, when you were talking about the poetry earlier, the poetic form that Shakespeare often uses is the blason, or blason if you prefer. Sometimes I've seen this spelt with an S. And this is this poetic form that fits into the convention of the Petrarchan sonnet, where you get the figurative language, which is not just describing the beauty of the lover, it catalogues their physical attributes, often in a way that emphasizes their unattainability by comparing them to jewels and the stars and the planets and so on. So we see the way that he blasons Juliet when he compares her to this jewel. Bear in mind that jewel, Juliet, first syllable of her name, it really signals that as well. So Juliet's the sun, she's the fairest stars in all of heaven and all this kind of stuff. But also in terms of the context, when we're looking at what's going on in poetry at this time, we've got this kind of rejection of this conceit, the blason, that's become very cliched. And you start to find lots of Shakespeare's contemporaries are parodying this kind of conceit in what becomes known as the contrablason, so this kind of rejection and subversion of it. And Shakespeare does this himself in Sonnet 130, where the famous opening line is, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." So in his own poetry, he's not going anywhere near this blason, it's cheesy. Whereas he's very happy to give this language to Romeo. Interestingly, Mercutio is allowed to adopt the contrablason. So he, when he's mocking Romeo's attraction to Rosaline, he talks about things like a high forehead, which doesn't have this particular exciting element to it, as well as getting into more traditional Mercutio territory by talking about her nether regions. But Juliet, interestingly, and this is where I tie it back to masculinity, she talks about what it means to be a man as well as the parts of a man, and she rejects this love poetry as well, even when she's thinking about the more intimate parts of Romeo. So there's something interesting going on here in the background in terms of the poetic language. And it's tempting to see the fact that by giving these conventions of the blason poetry to Romeo's speech, that Shakespeare is not just gently ridiculing youthful romantic idealism, but he's also ridiculing Romeo's brand of masculinity in some ways as well, and his choices as a lover, which don't tally with Shakespeare's own approach, particularly when it comes to his love poetry. So there's something interesting going on there, I would argue. So if we're going to try and tie all this together, and as I said from the outset, we've not got this kind of massive cohesive argument here. We at times we disagree about some of this, but that's the beauty of Shakespeare. It's what Emma Smith calls this gappiness, this great moral complexity, where when you're thinking about the aspects of the theme of masculinity, there's certain parts where you're left with ambiguity. But what I would say, if we're going to try to come to some form of conclusion, is this essay by Robert Applebaum is really interesting, in that you get this impression that the overriding theme is that the young men in Romeo and Juliet are not really in control of themselves. And this is a feature of the masculinity that they sign up to. They believe that they're controlling their own destinies by being able to adopt these particular masculine tendencies, whereas actually they're being shaped by the attitudes to masculinity at the time, which are still inherent in our society these days, I would argue as well. So that's what I'd like to leave us with, this idea about the moral complexity, that the fact that they're not really as in control of themselves as they might believe. Okay, I'm not sure if we've got any time for questions. If not, Caroline, we can happily take this onto Twitter straight after.